Well, I'm Malcolm Chalmers, the Deputy Director General here at RUSI, and it's my great pleasure to introduce and chair this event about management of defence after the Levene reforms. It's almost a decade now since Lord Levene and his panel produced a report on the structure and management of the Ministry of Defence, which argued that its proposals would create, and I quote, a model that ensures that the whole is more than the sum of the parts and which has affordability at its core. And I think it's appropriate that almost a decade on from that, we have this discussion taking place, of course, at a time when the integrated review is taking up a lot of decision-making time within the Ministry of Defence, but which amongst its many strands of effort it includes the very issues which we are going to be discussing today. And I'm especially pleased to be chairing this event because we have two excellent authors for the paper which has just been published. We have, of course, my long-standing colleague, Professor Trevor Taylor, who directs the Defence Industries and Society program at RUSI and is, of course, well known, I'm sure, to most of you as one of our country's leading experts on defence industrial and defence procurement issues. And we also, I'm delighted to say, have Dr. Andrew Curtis, who has recently left the Ministry of Defence, but during the latter part of his time there also had time to produce an excellent PhD, which he was awarded this year. So overlapping many of the issues which we're going to be discussing today. Of course, Trevor is in many ways best known for his work on defence procurement and the UK defence industry, much of which is characterised by an examination of that eternal tension between domestic and international procurement. One of these issues in which we have one white paper after another. We're going to have another review of defence industrial policy in parallel with the integrated review. And it's an eternal, and it often seems quite a cyclical debate. But today we're not going to be looking at that issue. We're going to be looking at the separate, but in some ways overlapping issue about the relationship between the centre and the single services. But it's much more than that, and it's eternal. It's a cyclical debate. It's been going on for probably a century in the UK since the Haldane reforms before World War One. And it's not going to be resolved anytime soon, but it doesn't mean that it's entirely cyclical. These things develop over time. They respond to environmental changes. They respond to changes in thinking. And most of all, it's complex and multifaceted. It's not simply a question of more or less decentralization. There are many dimensions to it. So I'm hoping we're going to explore many of those dimensions today. What we're going to do first of all is Trevor and Andy are going to tee us up for the discussion. I think they may take about 15 minutes in total. And I'm going to start with Trevor and then Andy and then Trevor, Andy again. And then we're going to, I may have some initial questions of my own and then we'll throw it open to discussion. This whole event, I would make clear, is actually being live streamed right now. So it is entirely on the record. If you wish to ask a question, please do so in the Q&A function on your screens, not in the chat function. And I will endeavour to get as many as possible of your questions put to Trevor and Andy before we finish promptly at 1 o'clock. Right, Trevor, over to you to get us started.
Thank you very much. Well, what we're going to talk about really is something about the nature of defence management. We're going to do something about history, a very little bit about history, as you say, leading up to the Levene changes. We're going to talk about the changing nature of military operations, and then that's going to lead us to our conclusions and recommendations. Perhaps some people will find our conclusions and recommendations a little radical, but we think that they're justified and certainly need to be fully aired. Just a word first about defence management. It's pretty unusual within government, and it's pretty unusual within wider organizations, because most defense management effort is about preparing capability, about getting things ready to do things rather than actually doing them. Of course, the preparation process is very important because, as Ronald Rumsfeld, the former American Secretary of Defense, said once, you go to war with the army you have, not the army you'd like to have. So preparation is very important. And of course, some of that preparation is about deterrence, and perhaps we're now paying more attention to that. But defense management is about preparing for contingencies that may not happen. And that makes it pretty unusual. It's reflected in the budget that we have currently. We looked and we see that the MOD's budget of about 38 billion, only 600 million of that is devoted to what the MOD calls operations. So you get a sense of the balance of effort. So that's a very quick introduction to the strange features, the slightly strange features. If you compare it with the health service or the police service, it's a very different sort of area where they're dealing with things that, you know, are happening all the time. So that's a start. I think we have to think about defense management in these terms. And the other point is just to reiterate what you said at the end, which was that, Malcolm, that it's a very complex business where there are lots and lots of moving parts. And therefore, for those reasons, we're sticking to the pretty top level thinking about defense management, but we are ready to, we think that reads down further down, as you'll see, into some of the recommendations. So now I pass to Andy for our next section.
Yeah, Trevor, thanks very much. I'm going to sort of dive into a little bit of historical context around the higher management in defence. And a good place to start, I think, is to recognise something that we all know. The Royal Navy, the British Army and the Royal Air Force were founded as separate entities at different times, and the single services are different. The environments in which they operate, the traditions that they've assimilated over time to develop the culture and ethos they have today, and their visions for the future are all distinct. The simple adage that the Navy and the Air Force man the equipment and the Army equips the man, I think, is a powerful pointer to the contrasting approaches that they have to capability planning. But for the most part, over time, organisational change within defence has been focused on unifying authority, or if you like, centralising defence management. The formation of the Ministry of Defence in 1946 and its unification under a single Secretary of State in 1964 are both good examples of that. But in many ways, the Levene reforms that were introduced after the 2010 SDSR marked a reversal of that trend by handing back more financial control and autonomy to the single services. At the same time, it also created a new four-star command, we all know Joint Forces Command, to strengthen the focus on joint enablers and joint warfare development. In contrast, head office was supposed to become smaller but more strategic. So I think there's little doubt that the Levene reforms strengthened the delivery of military capability through the alignment of responsibility, accountability and authority under the service chiefs. Before then, the single services had acted a bit more like pressure groups, with critical capability decisions actually being taken by the equipment capability customer in main building and the DE&S project team. In fact, a common complaint was that capability was thrown over the wall for commands to manage in service. And I think few would want to return to that. But the Levene reforms also brought with them some second and third order effects. And the most significant, we believe, was that the present system gives the single services too much freedom to pursue the capabilities that they choose. And this is often to the detriment of generating and maintaining a future integrated joint force that must be capable to operate seamlessly across the 5 operating environments. Trevor, back to you.
Thank you. Yeah, that takes us into the the next part of our reasoning, which is about the, if you like, the rising importance of information in future military operations. And by that, we mean that information that's collected from not just on land, sea and air, but also in space and in cyberspace, that it's analyzed and distributed as quickly as possible to enable the most effective decisions. The term that's being coined now in the United States is all domain operations. And if you wouldn't mind, I'll just read a short quote from a paper that came out since we finished our paper just the other day, but it nevertheless is very useful for this meeting. And it talks about all domain operations as a concrete effort to build sensors, communication systems, and data fusion engines designed to make possible for, say, a submarine, a Marine Corps infantry squad, an F-35, an Apache gunship, a P-8 patrol plane, an orbiting satellite, or a Navy ship to feed targeting data to any other weapon to ensure the most efficient and lethal response to a threat. Now, although this is an American quotation, it's to be noted that actually the UK operates all the systems that are limited there. And those systems, of course, need effective protection against hostile action. Now, basically, I think that we find it very difficult to see how the UK could get near this type of capability without what was the Joint Forces Command, but is now Strategic Command, without Strategic Command being in a demonstrably superior position, higher position than the traditional environment-focused services of the Army, Navy, and Air Force. So we have this challenge of how we deal with this rising importance of information. The second point that we would like to feed into the discussion is that while more and more organizations of a joint nature have been created over the years, the control of people's careers has remained almost exclusively in the hands of their home individual services. And we've got extensive but anecdotal evidence of how people in joint appointments do behave and the pressures they feel under. But the point we want to make here, emphasize here, is that current personnel systems actually incentivize people in joint appointments to favor the interests of their home service, because it is the home service that controls their future appointments and promotions. And this is a fundamental structural point within the way that defense is organized. We think the services themselves well understand the importance of this lever, and so we actually argue for a change in the personnel system that would encourage people and incentivize people to think in a joint and integrated way rather than in a single service focus. The third point is might seem relatively trite, but it's nonetheless important, that the government this time has made quite a deal of saying that it is launching an integrated review of defense and security, foreign policy, and development policy. And this to us makes it all the more important that defense is able to present to the rest of government an integrated picture in its own right, rather than a more splintered picture which is focused on separate services pursuing their separate interests. So Andy, to you.
Yeah, thanks, Trevor. Okay, so the last little bit of this introduction then is quite simply, what do we think should come next? So I think Trevor and I believe quite strongly that the single services remain best placed to develop and maintain their environmental capability. And at the same time, Strategic Command must continue to be responsible for joint enablers. But we suggest that additional measures are now needed to build more coherence into the defence effort as a whole. Much more than before the Levene reforms, the services generate capabilities and prepare separately and hope that they will be able to operate together if the need arises. But if defence is to embrace fully the opportunities offered by the integration of activity across all 5 of the operating domains and to prioritise in a coherent way, hope cannot be a planning factor. A solution must be found to ensure that the single services retain sufficient freedom of manoeuvre to procure and maintain appropriate military capability, but also provides head office with sufficient powers of direction and control to ensure that the capability choices of the individual commands actually deliver an integrated joint force that can cope with the threats of tomorrow. So we believe that MOD head office should be realigned to focus on its primary role as a Department of State, undertaking the core activities of policy, strategy, planning, and governance. Then one level down, Strategic Command should continue its three fundamental roles of generating strategic capability, leading digital modernization, and driving defense integration. But crucially, in those latter two roles, it should become the primary command with authority to direct and constrain the single services. And a clear signal for this would be to retain Commander Strategic Command as a 4-star appointment, but reduce the service chiefs to 3-star roles. The single services should continue to develop and maintain environmental military capability, but working to enforceable direction from above. We think this is fundamental to rebalancing the Levene reforms and ensuring the integration of the future joint force, making sure that that can actually be achieved. And then finally, in his speech to the Air and Space Power Conference in July, the Secretary of State for Defence, Ben Wallace, argued for greater integration between the services. And specifically, he said, we need to do things different, moving from a joint force to an integrated force. And we believe that the cornerstone for that is for personnel of all of the services to think defence, especially as they become more senior. A good way to achieve this would be to centralise the career management of all officers above a certain level. Realistically, OF5, which would then allow the single services to continue selecting their own unit commanders. This, if you like, Defence senior HR management function should operate within the Chief of Defence People's chain of command, although it wouldn't have to be physically located in Whitehall. Such a change would be central to building the coherence that strengthening the strategic staff functions in head office is intended to provide. But I must also stress that what we're suggesting here is to help facilitate a culture change, particularly in the senior ranks of the armed forces, to weaken inter-service rivalry and build a greater sense of common purpose. So that's basically it. Notwithstanding the improvements brought about by the Levene reforms 10 years ago, we believe there's a compelling case for further change to the higher management of defence today. That change must put the needs of defence above the aspirations of the single services to ensure the future force structure is integrated and able to meet the challenges being made by the ongoing changing characteristics of warfare. Malcolm, that's us.
Well, thank you all very much. And can I remind all participants that if they wish to ask questions, can you please put them in the Q&A? I think one or two people have put them in chat instead, so I don't want to, I may not call you if you put your question in chat. So can I maybe start with one question while people are thinking about their own questions, which really relates to what I guess is the most high profile and probably controversial proposal you make in terms of centralization of all service appointments. I think from lieutenant colonel level and above. I think that's your proposal as I understand it. And I guess the question is specifically in relation to the relationship between organizational change and cultural change. Essentially, you're arguing that this organizational change will drive cultural change, and that may well be the case. But if culture hasn't changed, and there's still a very strong attachment to single service allegiance, which is not simply about individual calculation of career prospects, but is much more emotional and deep-seated than that, I would suggest, then is there a risk, and how would you mitigate against the risk that you'd get compensating behavior, which would essentially nullify what you're trying to do? For example, services, formally or informally, coming up with non-interference agreements between themselves, in which even if formally the appointment of a colonel in the army, for example, is now a joint appointment. In practice, the other services will leave that appointment to the army, just as, and they will expect the same in return. Just say a little bit more about how you would, I mean, it's a radical reform, it may or may not be justified, but tell me, have you thought about the practicalities of how to make it work and achieve what you're trying to achieve? Who would like to start on that? Trevor?
I'll happily start on that, and I'm sure I can follow up. I mean, I think the principal thing that we were thinking of is actually we want to change the incentives on people. Currently, people placed in joint posts have pressures on them to always support their single service interests, even if they don't want to. They have that pressure. So we want to take that pressure away and allow people to, if you like, think defence, at least to the extent that they wish, when they're in joint appointments, rather than feeling constrained. That's the first point. I think the second point is that, you know, we are emphasizing, and I think people can recognize the importance of strategic command as an organization. Currently, that's not an organization that really gets to choose its own staff. They get the staff that the single services send or nominate for posts. And something that actually allowed if you like, a slightly higher perspective on who would be best to serve in single service commands, we think would be useful. Anecdotally, we've discussed many of these issues with middle ranking officers, and actually some people feel they should go further and there should be a single armed forces organization that deals with personnel. But we chose to focus just on when people leave, if you like, that they start to get above the orientation of their own service. We would observe that when people join, particularly the army, but they're encouraged to emphasize, to identify with their particular unit, whether it's logistics or an infantry battalion or what have you. And then as they go higher, they're expected to think in terms of the army as a whole. And when they reach the rank of colonel, they actually wear a badge that says, I'm an army as a whole person. It's a red tab. What we don't have is either a badge or even a sense of, now I work for defense as a whole. And that's what we're trying to promote.
So maybe you need some extra badges then.
That's one of the possibilities that's been aired to us, and questions of different uniforms and things like that. But that's not an area that we felt was necessary. We think that if you know, at least at this stage, putting in the kind of changes that we're talking about is, you know, would make a substantial positive difference.
Andy, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, just very briefly, I think the point that Trevor makes about the way the army manages its construct up to and into the general staff, I think there are lessons to be learnt from that, and you can sort of potentially apply that sort of model across defence. I think that would be useful. I think our suggestion is that you would move into this single space, actually one level above Lieutenant Colonel, so at OF5. And one of the reasons for that is that most of the command appointments that the services have are at OF4 level. And that's very much a single service business. And so I think sort of stepping into that, that joint management of personnel space at OF5 would be more appropriate. And the point that you make, Malcolm, about gaming the appointments process, I think is also, you know, very relevant. And a lot of anecdotal evidence kicking around that still goes on. And that's very much one of the activities that you would expect to reduce if you had a single, if you like, HR pillar above OF5, because effectively you would be managing everybody as a single pool rather than as three separate stovepiped pools, which I would suggest would then help you with the issue over single service favoritism. So I think we recognise that parochial issue exists, but I think that a single management above OF5 would actually go some way to solve that rather than make it worse.
Just a final question from me before moving on. So I think a related question would then be, how far do you think having such a system would then start to change incentives for people still being appointed on a single service basis at a lower level, but nevertheless hoping to move up? It would presumably start to change behavior at that level as well, wouldn't it?
So I think it would, and interestingly, looking at the Q&As, there's a question already been asked about, you know, culture change at officer training level. And so I think, yes, you know, there's a balance here. There is a reason why single services have their own ethos and their own culture, and their own focus on the way that they go about their warfighting business. And the last thing that we're suggesting is that we would want to do away with that. And so there is definitely a balance here. We still would recommend that somebody is a, you know, single service individual first, but actually as you progress, you should start to become more aware of the greater activities of defence around you. And I think what we're suggesting is that at the moment, that too much of that is being left to chance. There needs to be a more formal construct to ensure that that happens. And yes, I personally think that that would start at officer training, recognising that officer training is still a single service responsibility, and certainly the majority of the activity in that space would be single service oriented.
Very good. Right, we've got the questions pouring in, which is very helpful. I'm going to read out some related questions, which I'd be interested in your responses to, really around the role of CDS and the chiefs. So Hugh Strawn asks, does this carry implications for the authority of CDS as a 5-star appointment with command authority rather than as a chairman? And then Julian Brazier, who's well known to many of us, comments, it's a very interesting presentation. How would the proposal to elevate the strategic command commander, head of what's joint of strategic command, above the single service heads, fit with the existing central staffs? We already have a CDS and a VCDS. Isn't there a danger of duplication? So address those. There are others in the same theme, but let's address those first.
Okay, I mean, I can dive in there. Really interesting point that was made by Lord Richards at a evidence session for the House of Commons Defence Committee a short while back. He had to point out to the Prime Minister that the Chief of the Defence Staff did not have command responsibility over the service chiefs. Now that was a few years ago, but that I think is quite powerful. I think actually having a more formal command status from the Chief of Defence Staff downwards would be a good thing. And I think that would be a natural progression in what we're suggesting. I recognise the point about a danger of duplication. Trevor and I did discuss in this context whether, for example, VCDS would remain a 4-star appointment. We felt that that's getting into a little bit of tactical detail, and that a more detailed review would answer that sort of question. But at the end of the day, I think what we're suggesting is that there is a clear Department of State role that the head office can and should deliver on. That's the policy, the strategy, the planning, and the governance. Actually, below that, there is a direction and oversight, if you like, of the more tactical day-to-day capability creation and management activity that the single services are doing. And we feel that actually to devolve that down to strategic command and have a little bit of, if you like, clear blue water between the roles and responsibilities of head office and strategic command would actually make the management of that activity easier. And at the end of the day, I think everybody is recognizing that the need for integration and the need for all of these capabilities to operate seamlessly together is key. We've got to find a way to make sure that that happens before we need them in an operational setting. And at the moment, there isn't a construct for making sure that that can actually happen. And I'm not suggesting that there isn't a lot of good work going on out there, perhaps in penny packets, to make sure that it is happening in certain areas, but it certainly isn't being coordinated across the board. And if you look at all of the thinking around the integrated approach in the future, that has got to be fundamental. And so this approach would definitely assist that.
Very good. So just on that particular point, Andy, Tom McCain, we've got a very distinguished group of questioners, I have to say. It's very impressive. But Tom asks, he basically asks whether there will be increased tension between head office and strategic command, not necessarily creative. So I guess, Andy, you're saying, no, you think there would not be.
So I don't think it would be without its difficulties, but clearly you've got to address them if you want to deliver change. I think that a more focused head office doing the Department of State activity and identifying the policy issues and giving that direction would be a more focused output. So effectively, it would be devolving some of its current strategic HQ responsibilities to strategic command. Yes, I think there would be a tension in the first instance until there was an understanding of where those boundaries actually were. But I do believe that I think that's achievable. And I think once those boundaries have actually been recognised and accepted, the new construct would be a better construct for the way that we need to manage capability in the future.
Very good. Trevor, did you want to come in on this?
Well, I think that wherever we look around the world, there are always tensions and pressures between, if you like, the Department of State and the military sector. That's true in the United States. It's true in a lot of East European countries, where the structure that you have is that you have a Department of State and then you have a very strong joint military staff, which is not what we're proposing in this. And they give instructions to single services. So yeah, it's the nature of complexity. I mean, I think that the structure that we're offering has got can be translated into something like clarity on many issues. I mean, there are questions. One of the difficult questions to reconcile is in the area that you mentioned. I spend a lot of time with in acquisition and industrial policy. That there's a tension between the extent to which the UK should seek to rely on its own sources for military equipment and have the freedom of action that as a policy stance the government says is quite important, and the extent to which we should use imported equipment where we don't enjoy the same freedom of action because we have a need for constant external support for that kit. Now, that's the kind of thing which the Department of State has got to set the lead on and give direction down through strategic command. There's nothing you can do to make this simple, but we think that the structure that we have has at least got some possibilities, and particularly it pushes for greater integration of the single service efforts, and this point about building real communication among the different platforms and units that we have in the three services.
Okay, we have a number of interesting questions around the extent to which you're proposing something rather different from Levene in terms of the responsibility for capability planning of the single services. So Bill Robbins asks, if we really want Strategic Command to call the information data shots, they'll need more muscle to define the cross-domain joint information space. Frontline commands are well-resourced in comparison. How far do you want to move in that direction? And then the broader question within which that sits comes from Simon Webb, who asks, how do you see financial resource allocation and scrutiny being organized in your new structure? And then there's a other question further down. I think it was Mike Maiden asks about, would your vision for Stratcom involve a budgetary approvals role in investment programs above a certain threshold in the center, presumably? And I think that those are probably the main. So yes, and Philip Rowland again further down says Levene moved capability requirements definition from a joint central customer back to the single services and strategic command. Are you saying that's a mistake, or would you leave that largely where it is now? So lots of questions in the same space. Trevor?
So I think it's worth sort of targeting the last one of those questions first, because that's the easiest, and the answer is no. I think there is I think we recognise, and certainly the evidence of the last 10 years would support, that the single services are actually pretty good at developing and maintaining military capability that is within their own space. And so I don't think in fact, we're definitely not suggesting that that should change. I think what we're suggesting is perhaps above that activity, there needs to be more of a joint / integrated point of view prior to financial allocation and then the actual decision making over capability. So I think and I'd be interested whether there are, whether there's anybody on the webinar from main building who might have a view on this, but certainly the balance of investment decision space that exists within main building today is pretty limited. Once the budgets are allocated, the opportunity for the strategic headquarters to then input into what comes next is limited. And I think that actually allowing more input on balance of investment decisions at that higher level is really key here. And so making sure that when the services go off and develop and maintain the military capability within their own environment, it's making sure that actually that is for the good of defence. It fits into the future force structure, which in turn fits into the integrated concept and effectively how defence as a whole wants to fight in the future. And I think that at the moment, there is that coordination activity is not happening to the right extent at the top of that decision-making process. So I think in sum, we're not suggesting that the single services are bad at developing and maintaining military capability, but we've got to make sure that going forward, it's the right military capability that they're generating and maintaining, and actually that the ability of defence as a whole to then integrate the output, bringing it back to the point that Trevor was making about all domain operations, that's got to be coordinated as well. And we feel that that has to be coordinated one level up. And in fact, if you listen to Commander Stratcom, when he outlined his roles for Strategic Command, integration was a key activity for his command. We absolutely believe that that's what Strategic Command should be doing. What we don't feel is they currently have the teeth to be able to do that. And we feel that the way that they are given the teeth to do that is through some of the suggestions that we've proposed.
In that regard, Andy, we have an interesting question, which I think relates directly to what you just said, from an anonymous attendee, which I'm guessing maybe somebody in an official position, but I don't know, who says, I agree wholeheartedly with the observations about personnel behaving predominantly in single service interests. However, a key problem is that the single services own and control the manpower structure, which has limited the ability of strategic command to create its required staff investment in those areas for which it's responsible. And this goes right across the rank structure, not just the more senior positions. So would you, I guess the question is, in order to make what you're talking about work, would you need to apportion manpower liability to match strategic choices?
So I think that's an interesting call. I don't believe, and there's a little bit in the paper about defence forces as a whole, and we certainly didn't explore the sort of UK Defence Force concept and everybody wearing a purple uniform. I think we're a long way away from that. Certainly, the proposals that we discuss in the paper are a long way away from that. You've got to start somewhere to bring together the thinking about defence, because without that, we don't believe that the integrated approach that the future operating concept calls for is deliverable. So I think what we're suggesting at OF5 and above is a pragmatic first step, and ultimately they are the decision makers and the influencers as they progress up through the rank structure. And I think if you go back to, I think it was Mike's point, the question about reaching all the way back to the initial officer training constructs, I think by introducing and recognizing that there is a new joint HR structure at OF5 and above, if people are aware of that from the outset, then they are working towards that. And I think potentially they would have half an eye on how am I going to act when I am a joint defence officer rather than just my single service parochial views. It's a difficult one, but I certainly don't believe that moving to effectively a UK defence force in its entirety, and therefore giving all of that, taking away that problem in one foul swoop, I think that would generate more problems than this one that it would potentially solve.
I think, Malcolm, I just come with a couple of points. Okay. That first of all, and it's we're pretty well aware of the complexities of defence organisation, and that the implications that the things that we're talking about, as you spill them down into things like approvals processes and so on, would involve lots of change in the MOD. But we think that the paper's not capable of doing that. The MOD would pay a lot of money to consultants even to think about that. But it's the principles that we're trying to establish and the way that the system works currently. So we reckon, I think many of the questions we've asked ourselves already, they're very good questions, but they're questions that we've asked ourselves and decided that we would leave the level of detail as it is. I think the point that we've not made about the way the system works currently is that the devolution, and this is to do with perhaps with the powers and expertise of head office, is that there are two things really. That first of all, that UK defence policy is very multifaceted, as you would know. There are lots of missions for the armed forces, lots of tasks. And therefore, there's a challenge of making sure that those tasks are prioritised in a coherent way, rather than some services prefer, having their favourite tasks that they resource for, and the other services neglecting those tasks. British policy, you know, is very demanding in terms of being a global player, contributing to NATO, maintaining the nuclear deterrent, being able to do, you know, very intense war fighting, being able to do peace support operations, all these kinds of things. So we need to perhaps drive more, as much coherence as possible across those tasks. But the other thing is that, you know, the Levene reforms were meant to drive financial discipline. And we would suggest that the evidence from the NAO and from the sort of wider picture is that this has not really been the case, in the sense that, you know, defense, having allegedly balanced its planning, you know, plans with the expected money, I think in about 2012 under Philip Hammond, that's all evaporated, and we now have so there's a question, you know, the current system is not necessarily delivering the financial controls that some people might have hoped. And that's also part of the, you know, the delegation and reorganization debate, but it's not one that we cover centrally in the paper.
Okay. I'm very conscious that I think we've still got 20 questions remaining and about 15 minutes. So I apologize in advance if we don't get through them all, but I invite participants to look at some really interesting questions, many of which are actually additional contributions to our discussion. But let me turn to the question from Paul O'Neill, who is now based at RUSI, who's asking particularly about strategic command, which currently has a dual role. It's both a strategic interrogator, a higher function, if you like, but it's also delivering some enabling functions. And he raises the question as to whether there's a potential risk that they might prioritize their own areas in which they're responsible for delivery over other capabilities for which they're not directly responsible. Is there a contradiction in strategic command having that split function, or are you suggesting that split function should continue? So, Andy, can you answer that?
I can certainly give it a go. I mean, I think Paul makes a very good point. If you look at the three responsibilities that that strategic command have, they themselves recognise that their strategic capability management function, if you like, is a stovepipe pillar in much the same way as the other service commands, and the digital modernisation and integration activities are cross-cutting. I think we accept that the additional authority that they need, that we are proposing, would certainly help and be needed for those latter two activities. Would that then give them an edge, if you like, over the single services in terms of capability management? I guess potentially yes, but is it more important that they actually have the teeth, the authority to deliver the digital modernisation and the integrated responsibilities that they have? I think that is more important, and I think that today they simply do not have the authority to do that. In part of the discussions that we've had, quite a senior officer talked about, a former senior officer now talks about discretionary orders, and the fact that actually there are opportunities for direction to be ignored. And I think that there are situations where that absolutely happens. As a result, it is going to be very difficult for Strategic Command to manage its integration responsibilities without more authority. So I think, if you like, if there is a danger that by giving them more authority, that then allows them to prioritize their own capability decision making, I think that's a risk worth taking.
Okay, I have a couple of related questions now. One, which is actually from the chat is from Peter Levene himself, who asks, if you think the financial reforms are not being effective, is it not possible that the individuals responsible are not getting it right? And really a related question, which has come in from Mike Harwood, in the same vein, is what matters is the individuals who fill these appointments. We in the system know who can be trusted and who have a tendency to favor their own services when perhaps they should not. We don't want people who think the same, but we need people who can work together. So a central HR system might help pulling in 360-degree reporting and so on, so we get a much better view of who should take on highly complex roles. So that it doesn't matter, just matter that a single service likes a particular officer. What matters is the other services are happy to see that individual elevated, and he gives an example of that. So is it in the end all about the individuals, and how far can structures ensure we get the right individuals in the right places?
Malcolm, I think that the question of individual responsibility first from Lord Levene is a very interesting one, because basically service chiefs spend 2 or 3 years in their appointments. They're directed in how defence works to be the caretakers of their service, so they want to hand over their service in as good a position as possible. But after they retire, they're not held to account. In fact, it's, I think, a weakness in defence that, and perhaps in government, that it is so difficult to bring people back to ask them to explain decisions that they took 3 or 4 years or even longer before. So I take some of that point, that I think it's actual part of the system that people can make choices now that they're pretty confident will cause problems or perhaps require resource in 4 or 5 years' time, but they will be long gone by then, and they will never be called back and held to account. So that's a governance point that's not in the paper, but it's one that I think we should think about. I think trying to I absolutely take the point about the importance of individuals, but we're talking about the system as a whole, and the system as a whole almost requires people to be able to step outside that system and to see its faults and fix their own behavior accordingly. Whereas what we're suggesting is that we ought to try and create a system that encourages people to think in these wider terms. By the way, our proposal is not that people should, if individuals want to remain committed to a single service perspective, and some people do that, then the system, we would leave them free to do that. It would just obviously limit their Promotion Act possibilities, but they could still do that. They could still enjoy that comfort. But we think it's important that, the really senior people have this joint perspective, have a defence perspective.
Right. Another question, not quite the last question, but we're getting near the time, which is perhaps putting some of the issues we were talking about in a broader context, from John Patterson, who says, my experience of Joint Forces Command was that appointments into the command were often subject to deals between the service secretaries, but that staff invariably adopted a joint view once in post, despite the whipping efforts of at least one of the services, which we could all speculate on, no doubt. Is the real underlying issue that the chiefs have collectively failed to agree a winning concept for future warfighting? And I guess related to that, is there a prospect that will change as a result of the integrated review process? The winning concept for future warfighting, have we got a single concept? Andy?
So I think John makes a really good point at the end of his question, and during my research, a number of very senior officers pointed out the fact that if you look at SDSR 15, actually what it was a programmatic headmark. The Joint Force 25, it wasn't a conceptual one. It gave you a bunch of force elements, but it gave absolutely no direction on how they should fight. And I think that is a really key point that sort of John highlights. My understanding is that there has been some movement in that space. In fact, I think it was the Chief of the Defence Staff again at giving evidence to the Defence Committee about his own role. He pointed out the fact that there is an integrated operating concept on the books just about to be published, and I think that that's a really useful step. Clearly, all of the services need to be fully behind that. That then needs to be owned and delivered upon. And so for me, that is a clear integrating function that Strategic Command has responsibility for. But it does go back to the point, and I apologise, I'm starting to sound a bit like a scratch record here, is at the moment they don't have the authority to be able to deliver on that. And again, I read with interest on the Q&A the point about discretionary orders and being able to sometimes ignore direction. And I recognise, there's always an exception that proves the rule. But at the end of the day, if we want to ensure that we've actually got a future-proof force structure that is aligned to a defence-wide and defence-agreed operating concept, somebody's got to own that, and somebody has got to have the responsibility to make sure that the component parts, in this case the single services and Strategic Command for Joint Enablers, are delivering the right building blocks to make sure that that integrated force is delivered. And I think the final point that I would make, we haven't talked about this, but it is important. We all know that that resources are going to be scarce, and that priorities have to be recognised and accepted. And so again, once those priorities have been made, the decisions have been taken, you need somebody to make sure that those priorities are actually adhered to, and that people don't just go off and do their own thing because they don't like the priority direction that's been given. That's the sort of integrated role that we think Strategic Command needs to have the teeth to do, sat in the current construct, but one level below the Department of State that is head office.
Very good. One last question for Trevor. I mean, I was struck in the conclusion to your paper, which I believe is going to be emailed to all participants in this event just after we finish, so today. But in your conclusion, you actually wrote, I quote, "This paper has been prepared with little confidence that its direction of argument will be followed," which I thought was a rather pessimistic approach. You won't be disappointed, I suppose, is the plus side of that. But that really relates to Adam Coffey's question in the Q&A. Do you think the integrated review is likely to generate enough momentum for the cultural change you're suggesting? And if your answer is no, then why are you so pessimistic? Trevor, this is the last question. So,
well, it's a very good point. I think, first of all, I would say that some of the ideas that we're proposing are not new, and they were aired in previous reviews, and the services resisted them very strongly, particularly the control of people. And so in people's promotions and appointments. So we recognize, and I think the level of interest in the paper recognizes that this is a really contentious area. So what we're trying to do is air the strength of the points that we're making and the ideas that we offer. The challenge that we would throw out to those who don't like essentially the main proposals that we've made is, how do they propose that they're going to secure the integrated approach that's deemed to be necessary? We need people to think in defense terms rather than single service terms. We need people to recognize the importance of the information role, collection, dissemination, and so on. for all kinds of reasons. So, and we need people that are appointed into defence roles to be able to feel free that they're not putting their careers at risk if they are perceived to be damaging their home services interest. So, you know, if for people that don't like our ideas, please come up with the alternatives, because we think that that's a real challenge on the review. If the review does not come up with some mechanisms to address the problems that we've identified and the outline solutions that we've offered, if they don't come up with their own outline suggestions, then I think, you know, defence is going to continue to have problems.
Trevor, thank you very much indeed. Can I conclude by thanking all the participants in this event, particularly those who've asked questions. We've had 37 questions in this webinar, almost without exception, well informed, and many of them extremely well informed and provocative and very interesting indeed. So thank you all, and I certainly learned quite a bit, even from the questions which unfortunately I didn't have time to call. So apologies to those, but your questions have been logged. Secondly, but most of all, perhaps, let me thank Trevor and Andy. It's a mark of the best RUSI publications. Not that they have the answers, the correct answers to everything, because that's not the sort of issue we're looking at, but because they provoke a discussion and thought, and I think they've done precisely that. So maybe in the fullness of time, your concluding pessimism will prove unfounded, and actually the ideas you put in this paper will have an impact on policy, because many of the people involved in those policy discussions are listening to this webinar or will be reading your paper thereafter. So let me ask you all, if I could, virtually of course, to join me in thanking our panelists and indeed all of you who've attended for what I think has been a very rich discussion. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you.